obsession. Someone who's, has this narcissistic tendency, and we'll get into the psychological definition of narcissism and how the Quran deals with that subject and what the Quran comments on the subject later on. But there are different shades of narcissism. Somebody who's obsessed with themselves. There are two very different shades of it. One shade of it is someone who thinks they're more important than everybody else, right? Their feelings matter, nobody else's feelings matter. What they want is priority. What anybody else wants is not priority. They're not able to empathize. They're not able to connect with somebody else emotionally. They're not able to have even sympathy for somebody else. So long as it furthers them, their ego, their recognition, their agenda, their goal, their greed, whatever it may be, their status, their authority, that's it. That's all that matters, looking out for number one. That's one kind of narcissist. But the other kind is actually very subtle. It's someone who constantly thinks that everybody's out to get them and they're the victim. And they want special treatment because they are constantly being victimized by everybody else. Everybody else does wrong to me. I need special treatment because I'm always getting beat up, right? That's also a kind of self-obsession. Now you can't see anything you're doing wrong because everybody else is always doing something wrong, right? So one is kind of a positive arrogance, which is I'm better than everybody else and nobody else is as important as I am and I'm beyond flaws. And the other is I'm so broken and I'm so beat up and everybody hates me and that's why I need special treatment. Right, so that's also an obsession with the self, and those are extremes that I'm talking about. But there's a spectrum in between. So I don't want any of you, as you listen to these things, to go into the extremes. For myself also, to become extremely defensive about myself, or to become extremely self-victimizing and say, yeah, that's exactly me. Neither of those are healthy. And I pray that we're able to maintain that balance and that sincerity to the word of Allah and to see ourselves and others in an honest light. So I left off just commenting on the fact that Musa alayhi salam was brave enough to confront the Pharaoh on Allah's command and say, Inna Rasulu Rabbil Alameen an arsil ma'ana bani Israel. We are in fact the messenger of the master of all nations and all people, Musa and Harun say, that, and we come on account of the fact that you must now let the Israelites go. Right? So there are two components, really interestingly. I mean, this story is universal. So every component of this story has some universal value. There are two things that Musa alayhi salam is asking or is declaring. One of them is spiritual. So he's saying he comes as a messenger of Rabbil Alameen, of the master of all nations, right? So he's talking about Allah. He's talking about Allah. That's a spiritual component. And arsil ma'ana bani Israel, and we come so that you let the sons of Israel, meaning the children of Israel, the Israelites who are enslaved by the Egyptian emperor, right? You need to let them go. They are no longer to be your slaves, right? Which is a social or a call to action. It's not a spiritual declaration. It's actually the end to an injustice, right? So when someone speaks a truth, there's a spiritual truth, and tied to that spiritual truth is the call for some kind of justice. Right? Those two things go hand in hand. Very simply, in your life, you could say, well, for example, your uncle is, not treating his sons fairly or something like that, or he's not dealing with his business partner fairly. You can start with something spiritual, like how we all have to stand in front of Allah one day, and Allah will make what's fair, and He's going to ask us about everything that we do. And on that spiritual basis, maybe you can softly give the advice about maybe you should treat your business partner better. Maybe you shouldn't be lying to him about how much income we're making or something like that, right? So there's a spiritual foundation, and then there's a call to righteous action, to the right thing to do. And that's both of those components are here. He's not saying, this is really important too, I'm not saying you're wrong. Allah is teaching me that you're doing something wrong. So I'm not speaking on my own behalf. If you don't value what I have to say, if you don't care what my opinion means, because you could come to someone, last time I talked about power dynamics, you come to someone with a higher power position than yourself, an older brother, a parent, a grandfather, an uncle, an employer, a teacher, whoever, and you approach them about something they're doing wrong or something that is wrong. But if you're coming from a position of, listen, I just wanted to let you know or remind you that what I'm going to tell you, what I'd like to sincerely advise you of, is not because I hate you. It's not because I want to see you put down. It's because Allah wants it this way. Look at what Allah is saying and look at what you're doing, right? And I wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of Allah's word. And so I'm sincerely advising you of this, right? So it's actually an act of love, actually, to correct somebody lovingly and to do so with the backing of Allah's word. Now, this is very different than slapping somebody with religion and using an ayah or a hadith to humiliate someone. That's not what we're talking about here. But when he's engaged in such an atrocious behavior, dealing with people in this way, he gets support from the mention of Allah first. Inna Rasulu Rabbil Alameen. And then he makes the call, you need to let the Israelites go. And it's interesting connection, right? And that is, you treat them as your slaves, but they already have a master. Their master is Rabbul Alameen. And I came on the master's behalf. He wants his slaves back. They're not your slaves, they're his slaves. You understand? So it's like, it's putting somebody in their position. And Allah does this in the Quran, even in, for example, in really interesting passages on divorce law in Surah Al-Baqarah. And at the end, like for example, when Allah is talking about how not to engage in an abusive process when the divorce proceedings are happening. And at the end of it, Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions his highest status. Why would he mention his highest status? Because one person thinks, oh, they're getting away with something. And the other person, they're getting away with something. No one's getting away with anything so long as you recognize I'm the highest authority. I will decide how to act this out. Your vendetta, your grudge, your scars from before, none of them override my instructions on how to deal with this situation. You understand? So this is what Allah Azza wa Jalla does. This is how he pivots us to act in the right way. Alam nurabbika fina walida. It's muqaddam. What that means in simple English is, do you realize what a privilege it is that we're the ones that raised you? And that too in our own midst? It's not just that I financed you while you lived in the ghettos. I allowed you to stay within our midst. You, who have no class position to be here, were given this privilege. So the first element of the speech of the Pharaoh is to make Musa alayhi salam realize how inferior and how unworthy he even is of the good things that have been done to him by Fir'aun. Sound familiar? This is a very powerful tactic. That when the one in a position of control, when they hear something they don't want to hear, when they're asked to confront a truth that they need to confront, they will remind you that you are so unworthy of the good that has been done to you all along. While you, even before you made this offense of speaking up, even before this, you were unworthy of any of it. You didn't deserve any of it. We're the ones that were charitable. We're the ones that allowed you to stay in our midst, and we nurtured you. We nurtured you. What kind of nurturing was this? What kind of nurturing did Fir'aun give? Fir'aun can give material nurturing that's true. He can allow him to live in a palace. He can provide him food, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He can give him royal clothing, which he probably had. He could probably give him a beautiful horse or a ride, a chariot, status. These things Musa alayhi salam probably enjoyed. But now you see raising someone from the Fir'aun worldview and raising someone from the Iman worldview and the difference between them. There are people who will give you material things, and they will give you nothing spiritually, nothing morally, nothing ethically. How did you raise him a millionaire and you made it okay to have slaves? Because those two things are not mutually, because I did so much good to you in the material sense. I provided you a high level political education. You learned how things work inside the palace and the court. I'm sure Musa alayhi salam was very much familiar with the economics of the country and the more complex things that were happening in Egyptian society. It was the most advanced society of its time. So he's got a high level, PhD level kind of education. In fact, some historians even argue that royalty from around the world used to send their young to the Egyptian empire to gain higher education. So Musa alayhi salam is basically being raised in the Harvard of the time, right? He's getting that high class education, but that education comes at the same time with moral bankruptcy, right? Spiritually and morally, he's getting nothing from the Fir'aun. Nothing from him. In fact, the only way he's getting that is secretly from his biological mother, and actually also secretly from his adopting mom, Asya. That's where he's getting it from. But Fir'aun claims that what he gave him is actually nurturing. So what you see now is two different worldviews. Someone who feels they've done a lot, even though they've done good in the material sense, which can't be denied, at the expense of a moral upbringing, at the expense of teaching right from wrong. Because in fact, what Musa alayhi salam is coming and saying is completely right. And there will be people who may have done some good for you. They've done some good for you, but they may have done material good for you while they've done spiritual and emotional harm against you at the same time. So both those things have happened at the same time. But they'll claim and they'll make you feel inferior, or you might make them feel inferior for the material gain you may have given them, the material support you may have given them, even though you were, destroying them emotionally and spiritually, even though that was the case. And that's where alam nurabbika fina walida comes from. And the fact that when you do something, if you do something for someone you love, is the other part of this. If you genuinely love somebody and you give them something, you gave your dad a car, right? Or you gave your brother, you paid off your brother's loan, something. You did something for somebody. You never bring it up again. Doesn't matter if they hurt your feelings. That's not why you gave it to them. So that time I paid your tuition, you forgot already? You see, I knew you didn't deserve it. You would never do that. And if you do that, then you have a quality Fir'aun has. You see that? He's highlighting, if he did something out of nurturing love for Musa alayhi salam, then it's done. You did it out of love. It's not brought up. It's not used to remind the favor and to make someone feel how small and insignificant they are because everything you've done for them. The kind of people who like to remind how much everything was done for someone, that's the kind of person that shows that giving was not actually out of genuine love. It's actually out of eventually this will be a means of control. I'm giving, I'm going to get a return on my investment. If not a material return on my investment, maybe I'll get control this way. Because they'll always be buried under my favor. But if you gave, and you gave for sincere, genuine reasons, then you don't bring it up again. In fact, even the Quran says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تُبْطِلُوا صَدَقَاتِكُمْ بِالْمَنِّ وَالْأَذَى كَالَّذِي يُنْفِقُ مَالَهُ رِئَاءَ النَّاسِ. Believers, don't cancel out any charities you may have given by imposing it as a favor later on, by bringing it up, and by saying hurtful things. Right? So now that's exactly what he's done here. And that's exactly what you might find somebody doing. And that's a way of putting you in place. Everything I'm saying about Fir'aun has an effect on the listener. What effect is he hoping to have on Musa is what I'll conclude with today. What effect is he hoping to have by saying, Alam nurabbika fina walida? He's hoping to have the effect that he will feel so buried under the weight of my favors that he will feel that when he spoke truth, and he called out something wrong that was happening, that he'll feel so ungrateful. He'll feel ungrateful for saying the right thing. I am being so ungrateful and so dismissive of everything Fir'aun did for me by saying what I'm saying. I should be ashamed of myself. How could I question him? How could I challenge what he's been doing with the Israelites? How could I bring up a God other than him? How could I do that to him after everything he's done for me? One of the powers of an abusive controller is that they can make you feel like doing the right thing is an act of ingratitude, right? It works. It works. So you might hear things like, oh, so this is how you thank me for everything I did, huh? This is the thanks I get. This is how you show me gratitude. Wow, thank you so much. You know what? Now I really appreciate why I did everything for you. Right? And you're not being disrespectful or abusive. And if you are, that's something else. But if you're simply saying the right thing, just the right thing, and you're being slammed for it with the accusation of being ungrateful, this is a very powerful tactic. It didn't work on Musa alayhi salam, but on most of you, on most of us, it works. When you shame somebody, they back down. And then he didn't stop there. He did two other things, which I'll elaborate next week, but I'll give you a hint towards them. He said, وَلَبِثْتَ فِينَا مِنْ عُمُرِكَ سِنِينَ. And you remained in our midst for so many years of your life. So many years. You stayed even among us. In other words, we didn't just nurture you when you were a child. We allowed you to be an adult. I didn't throw you back among the slaves. I kept you royalty, even though you're a slave race. So many years of your life you lived here. And it also implies not just gratitude, now a new dimension, and that is you lived here. You don't know how to act in the palace? You don't know how to talk to the king? You don't know the kind of respect everybody gives me? You're going to talk to me like this? In other words, for saying the right thing, not only am I ungrateful, I'm also disrespectful. I don't have respect. In other words, the abuser is doing something wrong. This is what I'll conclude with. The abuser is doing something wrong, but by the end of this conversation, I don't feel like they're doing something wrong. They're making me feel like I'm the one doing something wrong. They're able to flip the script. And that's actually what psychologists talk about when they talk about, people that are in abusive relationships. They are trained to blame themselves. But even when they're being abused, they blame themselves. That happens because a good abuser knows how to put you to shame constantly and train you to blame yourself. You're not programmed that way to begin with. But it can be created. That environment can be created where you're constantly being fed, blame yourself, blame yourself, blame yourself. How could you? How ungrateful could you be? How disrespectful could you be? And when these things are used as a means of suppression and control, it works. It works so well that one of the most master evil politicians in history, Fir'aun, used it. Right? He used it on his nation, and he used it even in his own family. And so may Allah Azza wa Jalla help us recognize that in ourselves, and recognize the guidance of Allah Azza wa Jalla on how to respond to something like that through this story, inshallah ta'ala, as we'll continue.